to to the just got that to educating our children, because I can tell you that I think history has been glossed over, and I would love to see this publication. So Ross Dunn, Dr. Ross Dunn, grew up in rural Western New York State and attended State University of New York at Albany. After completing a bachelor's degree in history and French, he entered the graduate program in comparative world history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He specialized in African and Islamic history through the program, though the program also required studies in world history. Following fieldwork in France and North Africa, he wrote a dissertation that evolved into his first book, Resistance in the Desert, Moroccan Responses to French Imperialism, University of Wisconsin Press. In 1968, Dunn joined the history department at San Diego State University, where he initially taught courses in African history and world history. Mainly as a result of his world history teaching and Arabic studies at Wisconsin, Dunn undertook a major project in the late 1970s to write a narrative about the great Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, setting his extraordinary exploits in the context of Afro-Eurasian world in the 1300s, titled The Adventures of Ibn Battuta. The book appeared in 1987, University of California Press. It is now in its third edition, has been translated into several languages. An Arabic translation appeared in 2021. In the early 1980s, Dunn joined a diverse group of college and K-12 teachers to found the World History Association. He became its first elected president and remains an active member. In 1992, he joined a team of educators to write the National Standards for History, a project funded by the Department of Education and the National Endowment for the Humanities, under the supervision of UCLA's National Center for History in the Schools. Dunn served as the coordinating editor of the National Standards for World History, a project involving dozens of teachers and public interest groups. An assortment of media personalities, pundits, and politicians on the political right, however, attacked the standards as a product of left-wing, anti-patriotic faction of university professors. Dunn joined a large group of educators in defense of the standards in a public forum. God bless the truth, I can add that. Subsequently, Nash, Crabtree, and Dunn wrote History on Trial, Culture Wars, and the Teaching of the Past. Alfred Knopf, a study of standards, debate, and narrative of public controversy over history, education in the United States. 2001, he initiated a project to develop world history for all of us, a web-based model curriculum for world history in middle and high schools, funded initially with a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and developed by a team of teachers, academics, and technology specialists. World history for all of us has reached many thousands of teachers. Dunn retired from San Diego State University in 2008, but has continued his career as a writer and educational consultant. In 2000, he edited The New World History, A Teacher's Companion, a volume of more than 50 essays, mostly previously published on problems of conceptualizing and teaching world history, St. Martin's. In 2016, the University of California Press published a new collection entitled New World History, The New World History, a field guide for teachers and researchers. In 2015, he authored Panorama, a world history textbook for college and AP students. A new version of this textbook, which addresses world history from the Paleolithic era to the present, is forthcoming from Bloomsbury Public Academics. In 2012, Ross Dunn and his wife, Jean, moved from San Diego to Los Angeles in 1912 and have 2 daughters in the area and 4 grandchildren. So that's a very brief bio on an extraordinary career. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ross. And again, thank everybody for being here. And Ross, I'm going to pull up your PowerPoint and have it ready. And if you wanted to, do you want to share the screen? I'll help with moving the slides along. Does that make sense?
Yes, I've shared the screen, David.
Do you guys see it?
Not yet.
Okay, so maybe I need to accept.
No, you have to go underneath the green, it says share screen, the arrow at the bottom of the Zoom.
Give me one sec. I'll get there. Full screen here. Share screen. Boom. Share.
Okay.
Do you guys see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Beautiful. Oh, I wish I did. I gotta see it. So I gotta figure out how to see it.
And it's in, you have to go to the PowerPoint.
I know I'm looking for it real quick here. Give me a sec.
Which are your PowerPoints?
Why don't I see it?
Are those yellow ones PowerPoints?
I'm embarrassed. I can't get this. Hold on here.
Here it is. You see it?
Oh, goody. Sorry about that. Okay. Here we go.
Mm.
Ross, ready to go?
I have to make one correction in the biography, David.
Oh,
You said I moved to Los Angeles in 1912. It was actually 2012.
okay. Oh,
My parents were alive in 19.
that was the year my dad was born. Okay, no worries. Okay, thank you for correcting me. I hope to not make any more blunders, but ready to go.
Yeah, well, thank you all for inviting me to participate with this group. I'm very pleased to do it, and I'm sorry for the technical issues. So what I'd like to do is just give you a quick review of Ibn Battutta's career, and having some visuals may help with your reading of the book if you haven't already finished it. David, I'll just say click, okay?
Yeah, yeah.
So click. I think all of us have had the experience of being in a different state or a different country and suddenly running into somebody we knew. Well, this was happening to Ibn Battuta in the 14th century as he was traveling back and forth across the Eastern Hemisphere. Repeatedly, he ran into people that he'd already met. Click. Go ahead. When Ibn Battuta was in the southern coast of China in Fuzhou, he tells us that he ran across the man, and he says, when we conversed after our formal greetings, it occurred to me that I knew him. I looked at him for a long time. He said, I see you looking at me as though you knew me. I said, which country are you from? He said, from Ceuta. I said, I'm from Tangier. Well, Ceuta is about 40 miles from Tangier, where Ibn Battuta was born. He greeted me again and wept, and I wept too. I said, have you been to India? He said, yes, I have been to the capital, Delhi. When he said that to me, I remembered him, and I said, are you al-Bushri? And he said, yes. Click. So what makes this story quite amazing, this is animated, David, so click once again and see if it works.
I see.
He met al-Bushri in Delhi, and then click again, he met him again in China, and then when he was back, all the way back to North Africa, he ran into al-Bushri's brother, and his comment in his book was, how far apart they are. So this was happening to him all the time. Click. So down there in the left-hand corner, you see Tangier, which is on the Strait of Gibraltar. And It was a small city, but it was a very vibrant cosmopolitan city because of its bustling port. And not only were Moroccans going in and out of Tangier, but merchants from Genoa, from Venice, from Catalonia, and from other places visited as well. So he would see these people, I think, as he was growing up, and maybe that gave him an urge to travel. Go ahead. This is a view of the old city of Tangier, and Ibn Battuta's house would have been up there on that hill somewhere, but we don't know exactly where it was. Go click. In Morocco, and especially in Tangier, Ibn Battuta is something of a folk hero. So there are streets named after him, as we see here, streets, cafes, bookstores, ferries that go across the Strait of Gibraltar, all named after Ibn Battuta. Like, he has a very long full name, and if you look at his name there in green, you see at the bottom it says Alawati, and that means that he has a descent from a Berber tribe called the Lawata. So he has a Berber ancestry, but in terms of his culture, he was an Arabic-speaking gentleman. And then it says Atanji meaning that he comes from Tangier. So that's where he was born and raised. He studied law and religion there. And then he left home in 1325 to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. That was his initial plan. He was gone for 29 years, came back, and then wrote a book about his travels. If you click this, David, we'll see an animation of his travels.
It's amazing.
And then back home again.
Wow.
His final trip across the Sahara Desert to the Mali Empire. Go ahead. Go ahead. So I have 5 reasons for why he traveled. One, first of all, was to make the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca. Second one, to become better educated in religion and law. He was a devotee of Sufism, which is the mystical dimension of the Islamic faith. And he was looking for Sufi masters and saints to affiliate with. He traveled to seek employment, and he was employed gainfully in India and the Maldive Islands. And finally, he visited some places, and he never tells us why he went there. So we figure he just went there because it was there. We don't know. You see here a list of all the incredible things that happened to him. I won't read all this, but you can see it. In the early part of this century, 2006 or so, I made 3 trips to Morocco to consult on a projected movie of Ibn Battuta, a full-length feature film. Unfortunately, although there was some seed money from the royal family of Morocco to start up the project, we never did get the big money needed for the huge production values that would be required to make a film about him. So it has yet to be made. I'd like you to think about this idea of Afro-Eurasia, which I use in teaching world history. That is to consider Africa, Europe, and Asia as all sort of one place in the world, one supercontinent in which people were interacting over long distances from very ancient times. And Ibn Battuta was one of them. So he's going all the way across Afro-Eurasia and back again. Good. Ibn Battuta had the advantage, you might think it was a disadvantage, but he had the advantage of traveling during the later part of the Mongol age, the period when Mongol empires stretched across a large part of Afro-Eurasia. This is long after the time of Genghis Khan. This was when his descendants were in power. Go ahead. I'll just say go ahead rather than click. So you see this map of the orange, the pink, the green, the blue-green are all Mongol states. And this was a period when these states were quite stable. And it was relatively easy for people to travel back and forth across them. So it was a good time to travel. Earlier century probably would not have been so good, but he chose well in that respect. Go ahead. So he started his travels by going to Mecca, and that's the looking down on the central mosque of Mecca. I'm sure you've seen images of this before. Go ahead. So if you look at his travel map again, you see Mecca there, and you can see that Mecca was really the hub of his travels. As he was moving along, he was always either going toward Mecca or going away from Mecca most of the time. And we think that he visited Mecca maybe 5 times during the travels. Yep, go ahead. So he also traveled to advance his education. And here we see a slide of members of the educated class. This is from a painting that was done in the 13th century. He was a member of what was called the ulama. The ulama are the educated class of Islam, and they're highly respected, were highly respected throughout the Muslim world. So just by being a member of that group, even though he never became terribly educated himself in terms of advanced education, he never got a PhD, as it were, but he was very much respected as a member of this class of learned scholars. And when he was traveling, he would often visit colleges. He could go to the college, he could get a meal, he could get a bed, he would associate with the scholars. And in Damascus and in Mecca, we know that he did spend some time studying, but he was always too anxious to get on the road, and it couldn't take time to study very much. We see here that, back that one up. This was a period of extraordinary college building, university building, you might say, in the Muslim world. And we see here on the left one of the beautiful colleges in Fez in Morocco that was built during his lifetime. The upper slide is the big building on the left is one of the great colleges of Cairo, which was also just being built when he came through. I included that picture down at the bottom of Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, not because Ibn Battuta ever went to England, one of the few places he did not go, but because the building of the Oxford and Cambridge colleges was influenced and inspired by Muslim colleges in terms of how they were organized, especially the administration of the college. And this college, the oldest court of Corpus Christi College, was built also right in the middle of the 14th century. Go ahead. And then, as I said before, he traveled as a Sufi, and he was very interested in studying with Sufi masters, taking part in Sufi esoteric rituals and so on. And he did this over and over again. Sufi masters were known for exuding a quality called baraka. Baraka is actually a word related to Barack, as in Barack Obama. It's the same word. So baraka means blessing, and he would go to these places to seek the blessing of the Sufi sheikhs called Baraka. And then he traveled to seek employment. He knew there were jobs going down in India. The ruler of India was a Muslim of Turkic extraction, the Sultan of Delhi, and he was very interested in surrounding himself with educated Muslims who would serve in his administration in various ways, sometimes as lawyers, sometimes as managers of hospitals and so on. And so he was especially keen to have Arabic-speaking scholars come to Delhi because they carried a certain prestige just by being Arabs, because Arabic was the language of the Prophet Muhammad. So Ibn Battuta was almost assured of getting the job in Delhi, even though he was not, as I said, a highly educated legal scholar. He describes this tower that you see, this minaret, in his own book, and it's still standing there in Delhi. Yeah, go ahead. He spent much of his time on or near the palace of the Sultan of Delhi, and this is what is today a ruin of that palace, which is just to the south of modern New Delhi. Now, this portrait was painted by an artist for an issue of National Geographic magazine published in 1991 about Ibn Battuta. I was a consultant on that project as well. And here it shows Ibn Battuta meeting the Sultan. I might mention here that nowhere in his own book about his travels does Ibn Battuta say anything whatsoever about his own appearance other than that he had a beard. Just once he mentions his beard. But for a Muslim scholar, that would be common that he would have a beard. So there's nothing unusual about that. But other than that, we don't know if he was fat or thin or tall or short or what the hue of his skin was or anything. Go ahead. So he got a job as a judge in Delhi and served in that capacity for a while, even though he had a lot of helpers. He admits to having them, and that his job was something of a honorary, a sinecure, if you will, because we don't have evidence that he actually did much work as a judge, but he does describe one or two cases that he adjudicated. I might note here that India at that time, the majority population was Hindu, but the ruling class was Muslim, and there were a lot of Muslims. There were hundreds of thousands of Muslims living in India at the time. Well, Ibn Battuta got in serious trouble with the Sultan of Delhi, and he was almost executed, but the Sultan forgave him and finally actually offered him the position of leader of a diplomatic mission to China. Now, China at that time was under Mongol rule. You've heard of Kublai Khan. Well, he was dead by then, but it was one of the successors of Kublai Khan who still ruled in China. And he was not Muslim, but nonetheless, the Sultan of Delhi organized this mission as a diplomatic mission. We don't know exactly why, to go to Delhi. Unfortunately, they got as far as the southwestern coast of India, the city of Calicut, called Kozhikode today. And there a storm came up, and the ships that were supposed to make the voyage to China from that point were sunk. One of them was not sunk, but it sailed away and didn't come back. Ibn Battuta, however, was not on the ship at the time. He was still on the shore, and he was on the shore arranging for accommodations for his concubines to go with him on the boat. So when that accident happened, he thought, well, I should go back to Delhi. But then he said, oh, I'm not going to go back to Delhi because the Sultan will say, if the mission went down in a storm, why weren't you on the boat with it? And he was afraid of telling the Sultan that when I was making arrangements for rooms for my concubines, that I didn't. So he never went back to Delhi, but he did go on to the Maldive Islands, the next one. And he got a job there as a judge called a qadi in Arabic, the word for judge. And he was there for nearly a year and a half serving as a judge. I won't go into it, but he got involved actually in an attempt to overthrow the queen of the Maldive Islands and take power himself with several co-conspirators. That plan came to nothing, but it does point up that the fact that Ibn Battuta was a real adventurer. You know, he was not maybe the sweetest individual in the world in the 14th century, and people like to present him in a very positive light. But he was also a social climber and ambitious enough to get involved in a coup d'état, which fortunately for the queen failed. So he decided that he was going to go to China on his own. We don't know exactly why, but he did. There's controversy about how much of China he actually ever saw. And I argue that he did visit the south coast of China, but probably not more than that. I included this slide of the Great Mosque in Xi'an. He didn't go to Xi'an. It's way far north in China and in the interior. But it's a good representation of the fact that there were many thousands of Muslims living in China in the 14th century. So it made some sense for him to go there. Glad. Well, then he left China and he headed for home. If you can click again there, I've got some arrows that'll point that out. So he goes back home. Notice that he stops in Mecca again on the way home. And my map here stops in Tunis, but he didn't stop in Tunis. He continued on back to Morocco. And then in the next slide, we see that he had that final trip, which was the one across the Sahara Desert to Mali. Again, we're not sure why he went to Mali, whether he was emissary of the Sultan of Morocco or not, he never makes quite clear. But he provides us with the only eyewitness account of the Mali Empire in the 14th century. So it's a precious document that we have. Okay. So his trip to Mali, he went over the Atlas Mountains and then down into the northern Saharan Desert along this river valley. My dissertation research for my doctoral thesis actually concerned this area of Morocco, so I've got lots of pictures that I took myself. The next one shows, this is the caravan city of Sijil Massa, which is today the ruin that you see here. But it was a huge staging area for caravans going across the Sahara Desert. And that's where he went first and then joined a camel caravan. And that's where he met El-Bushri's brother. So across the desert, adventures in Mali, and then back again, and returning to, go ahead, David, to the Moroccan capital, which was the city of Fez. And it was there that the Sultan of Morocco heard about him and said, I want you to write a book about your travels. And if the Sultan asks you to do that, you don't say no. So that's what he did. And he hooked up with a young scholar whose name was Ibn Juzai, who was a literary scholar with literary skills that Ibn Battuta didn't necessarily have. So he was what we call an amanuensis, a collaborator with Ibn Battuta on writing the book. It was the same with Marco Polo. You know, he didn't actually write his own book. He wrote it with the help of a guy named Rustichello, who was a literary scholar. So they sat in Fez and wrote this book. Ibn Battuta would have prayed in the Grand Mosque, the Al-Qarawiyyan Mosque in Fez, which is a very famous monument you can see today. Go ahead. This is from an Aramco magazine article, which shows Ibn Battuta working with Ibn Juzai, his collaborator. I don't know why they make him look so fat on Ibn Battuta on the right. We have no evidence that he was. So in 1354-55, they wrote this book, Ibn Battuta basically dictating his account of his travels to Ibn Juzai, and Ibn Juzai writing it all down. There's a tradition that Ibn Battuta is buried here in this tomb, which is in the old city of Tangier, but there's no evidence of it. And some scholars think that he wasn't buried there at all, but this may be another member of his family or a descendant. His grave may be somewhere near the modern city of Casablanca, probably underneath the modern city of Casablanca, but we don't know. So we know about Ibn Battuta's travels because he he wrote his own book about it, and it's a very lengthy book. It's called a rihla. A rihla is a term in Arabic that simply means a book of travels, and it was a popular genre during the 14th century of writing this sort of book, usually built around a trip to Mecca and back again, which he did, and of course much more. And then in the mid-19th century, the copies, or two copies actually, of the complete work were discovered by two French Jesuit priests in Algeria when Algeria was ruled by France. And they brought those home, and they prepared a printed edition in Arabic, and then they translated it into French. And here we see this with the Arabic on the top and the French translation on the bottom. After that, the book was translated into several languages, including English. And so we have that. And when I was doing my research, I'd had Arabic training, but my Arabic was still not of an advanced level that I could skim through the Arabic edition of the book. So I worked mainly with the translation, but I had the Arabic edition at hand that I could use where I thought I needed to. And so if you want to read his own travels rather than my account of his travels, you can do that too. It's readily available. Many people say, well, was Ibn Battuta John Mandeville? John Mandeville was a 14th century Englishman who claims to have traveled all over the world, but it turns out he never went anywhere. Could that have been the same for Ibn Battuta? Well, we're really sure that that's not the case, and that his travels are authentic. They're not a hoax. They're not fake news, and that most of what he says is reliable. But there are questions and puzzles. In the next slide, you can see pointed that out. First of all, the book is a work of literature. It's not a diary. It's not a log that he kept during his travels. It was all done after he got home, and it's a work of literature of a particular genre that I call the rihla. But also his itinerary, both and his itinerary and his chronology are sometimes very, very confusing. You know, it would be like writing that I traveled from Detroit to New York, and I passed through Los Angeles on the way. It doesn't make sense, and a lot of this sort of thing in the rihla that I tried to figure out, and other scholars have as well. And the chronology is confusing. He did not visit a few of the places that he claimed to have visited, not very many, but we do have some pretty good evidence that a few places he says he went to that he didn't go. I can talk about that. And then finally, he did plagiarize from one or two, at least two other earlier travelers here and there in the Rilla. And plagiarism wasn't quite seen the same way then as it is now. At that point, in the 14th century, to copy an earlier writer was to show respect for them and to say, okay, well, they did a really good job of writing about such and such, so I will include them. And in some cases, he actually acknowledges that he is copied from somebody else, but in other places, he doesn't. Well, Ibn Battuta is becoming increasingly well known to the point where if you click again, it'll point up that, yeah, there is a crater on the moon named after Ibn Battuta, which shows that he does command respect in the world today. And I'm very pleased that Ibn Battuta is taught in our schools, in history classes. In California, every seventh grader learns about Ibn Battuta, and in many other states as well. And there have been a lot of books written about him. And none of them quite like I did it, but they're more studies of his text rather than his life. But I'm pleased to know that, and I feel that Ibn Battuta is a much more interesting character than Marco Polo in many respects. Marco Polo's kind of a, if you've read his account, he's kind of a stick man. You know, he's talking about there be this, there be that, there be dragons and so on. But Marco Polo reveals very little about himself. Ibn Battuta reveals a lot of things about himself. His wives, his concubines, the people he didn't like, the people he did like, the food, and on and on. So it'll make a great movie whenever it's done. I'd like it to be a 12-part TV series. I think that would be the best way because it's also. Well, I'm going to stop there and thank you very much.
Wonderful.
It was really great, Ross. And there's so much to learn about Ibn Battuta, so we're very grateful for the illumination on this, and it really goes to our group in so many ways because we cover all the area he covered.
So was Ibn Battuta, it's Alicia Massey. It was wonderful listening to you, Dr. Dunn. It was really wonderful. What money did he have in order to do these incredible travels over all these years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to tell you a very quick anecdote about that. I gave a talk about Ibn Battuta in Seattle at the Asian Museum on the campus of the University of Washington. And Bill Gates' stepmother was involved with that center, and I met her, and she brought Bill's father to my talk, and I gave the talk, and I said, "Are there any questions?" And he was sitting in the front row, and he shot his hand up, and he said, "How is he funded?" I was pretty quick on my feet at that point, and my answer was, I said, well, Ibn Battuta, when he started out, he had a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to set up a series of small schools, but he never did it. Well, obviously that's not true, but I did get a good laugh out of it. Yeah, I would say first of all, as I was mentioning before we started, that any wayfarer in the Muslim world is going to be able to receive fundamental a bed, a meal, because the Quran enjoins Muslims to aid wayfarers, and especially wayfarers who are on their way to Mecca or have been to Mecca and are coming back home again. So fundamentally, he could always get along and survive. But we don't really know entirely how he got money during the first part of his travels. But by the time he went to Anatolia, to Turkey, he was visiting the courts of a number of Turkish princes there. And because he was a member of the ulama, the learned class, he was treated with great respect, and they would ply him with gifts, robes of honor, gold, jewels, slave girls. And by the time he left Anatolia, he was loaded down with these gifts, and he had an entourage traveling with him. We don't know much about that, but he did. And he, on that basis, he managed to get to Italy. What did I say? Italy to Delhi. And then in Delhi, he made a lot of money. He lost it all when he got in trouble with the Sultan and when the ships went down. So how he survived on the trip to China, we don't really know, except that as a member of the learned class, he could probably count on being treated well, and maybe also was a good source of intelligence because he was a traveler. He'd come from abroad, and the local ruler, he always seemed to be meeting up with rulers. They would ask him, you know, okay, you just came from Damascus, what's going on there, and so on. Who's in charge? So we think that probably answers the question.
I guess he was the Google of his time.
Right.
I'm wondering if I can ask a question about, you know, in about page 116, 117, you talk about Islam as the religion of trade and of the seamen, and how there are so many people who Islamic people who traded, and they started forming colonies along the coastal areas. It sort of reminded me of how the Greeks, you know, settled around the shores of Anatolia and bringing, you know, Hellenic ideas and things like that. But, you know, the Muslims did that on a huge scale. And you also mentioned that they used some of the Muslim values, that Muslim was sort of like the religion of trade. Was as a Qadi, were there legal aspects of the trade that Muslims brought with them? Because you know, did they settle disputes in certain ways? Were there certain, you know, guidelines as far as how trade was to be carried out? What made the Islamic traders so successful? And how is that tied to the Islamic religion?
Right. Well, the answer that's usually suggested right away is that the Prophet Muhammad himself was a merchant, right? And that as Islam emerged and the Quran was presented, and the traditions of the Prophet were these remembrances of what the Prophet said and did, all were very positive about the mercantile activity. That commerce is important and it's honorable. And I say that because it wasn't that way everywhere. In China, merchants were regarded as the lowest of the low. You know, merchants, you know, they didn't make anything. They didn't produce anything. They just bought
Mhm.
and sold for their own profit. So
Mhm.
they had to have merchants. All societies do, but they did not have much prestige. Whereas in the Muslim world, they did, and more than in the Christian world as well. And that's a tradition that really goes back to the Quran. There's plenty. I'm not a Sharia scholar, but there's plenty in the Sharia that addresses various aspects of commercial behavior and how you treat people fairly and how you don't overcharge and so on. So uh,
Okay, thank you. By the way, um, I wanted to say that, I've been reading a bit about the Silk Road and things like that. And from what I read, it was the Sufi travelers who traveled along, the Sufi religious people who traveled along with the caravans, that really helped um, much of Central Asia, uh, more towards Central Asia and Northern China, helped the population convert to Islam. And it was because some of the dances they did, some of the religious practices that they had were very similar to what some of the Northern Asian, the Mongolian, some of the people in those areas, the types of religion they had. And because it was very similar, and there were many, many Muslim tradespeople going along that portion of the Silk Road, that it was an easy religion for some of the Asians, Central Asians, Northern Asians, to uh, feel some kinship with and convert to. So I thought that was very interesting.
yeah, that's right. And, Sufism really represents the mystical dimension of Islam. Christianity, Judaism, they both have that mystical side. The Kabbalah in Judaism and Christian mysticism as well, which is concerned with less with outward worship and more with the uh, this seeking of closeness to God, however God might be defined. And of course, there were a lot of Buddhists in Central Asia at that time already. That Sufism was introduced to Central Asia, and there were certain, I think, commonalities and understandings with the Buddhist tradition of meditation and so on, and that uh, is highly compatible with the Sufi dimension of Islam. I don't know if that's a historical thesis I could write or not, but that's what I would say. And Sufis were, they were like monks in the sense that they would wander around on their own and they would go into villages and meet people. And it was very much true in India that it was of Hindus who were converted to Islam. It was mainly through Sufi sheikhs who were wandering through town and converting.
Oh, interesting. By the way, when you were on the tour with Catherine and David, did you happen to see, did Catherine talk about the Quran that it's not on display now, but it has paper flecked with gold, given by now, it was probably one of the early Ming rulers, but it's sheets of colored paper flecked with gold that he gave to Timur. And Timur's sons made a Quran out of it. It's beautiful. The medallions and the calligraphy are just gorgeous. On the paper is very much intact because I think they use something like lead in the paper to kill any of the insects. But that's definitely something you might be interested in seeing sometime if you
Yeah,
haven't.
we were in the museum, but I don't think we saw that one, David.
No, if you
It's
come back, Ross, I'm sure that on a scheduled visit, if you're visiting family, we'll have more time and we could plan something a little more robust with Catherine and the gallery and the whole setup of our Asian Islamic activities.
Yeah, and of course, Timur's descendants presided over an extraordinary cultural um, renaissance, we could call it that, centered on the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara and so on in the 15th century. In my world history textbook, I try to point out that Italy was not the only place that a renaissance was going on.
There's an author who writes a book that the Renaissance was actually started by the Chinese when they came to trade in Florence. I don't know if you've ever heard of that history or if it's um, accurate or not. And it's fascinating because they supposedly brought paper and pasta and gunpowder to Florence. It was right after the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you know about that author.
I don't think so. I know about one author who's written about the Chinese were the ones who discovered America, but that's not the
That's
same.
the same guy. I'll cover that with you offline.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think his book that I know is nonsense. But
That's what most people think, yeah. They say there's mitochondrial DNA in the population, but anyway.
I always heard that Marco Polo went to China and brought spaghetti back.
Well, I did masters in my master's in architecture. My advisor was Japanese, and he had a very interesting theory that, theories and thought travel from east to west and around the world that way. And we pick it up and we add to it and, elaborate, and it goes back and then back again. So it's a east-west information circle. So maybe that's, where we are right now.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. Well, anybody has more questions, please, so we can elaborate more. If not, yeah, go ahead, please, Tabo.
Yeah, Doctor, you mentioned about the commercial behavior. It's very different. Can you elaborate a little bit there? How does that impact now? I mean, how does that
I'm sorry, the commercial behavior of Muslims?
Yeah, you were saying actually you were right about in China they really like people don't respect the people they do the trade or salespeople, or they didn't at least. But then you were saying in Muslim world actually they are well respected, or maybe it's popular. So what does that how does that impact the culture or the kind of system?
Well, if we look at especially the pre-modern world, well, not just the pre-modern world, but I think up to today that Muslim engagement with commerce has always been a highly respected profession, and I don't think that's changed. I keep thinking of a place like Dubai, the Emirates and Kuwait and the extraordinary commercial wealth that is concentrated in those places. So Yeah, merchants have always, along with scholars, and often merchants and scholars were the same people in the Islamic tradition, whereas I don't think that's necessarily that it's not true in the Christian tradition really so much.
Hey, that's interesting. Yeah, I know. I never thought about that way. Yeah, I wasn't.
Do you think is it because merchants were travelers and then they knew more than the people who stayed behind? So that way they were scholars because they knew a lot of, interactions between every place they visited.
I probably think it worked both ways. Merchants became scholars, and scholars became merchants, but
And
highly compatible. I mean, Ibn Battuta, for example, was he was a scholar, somewhat under false pretenses, but a scholar nonetheless. Not a great scholar, but he was a member of the scholarly class, and he was not a merchant, and we have no evidence that he participated in any sort of mercantile activity at all, except he did in his book talk here and there about the prices of things, what was being sold and bought. But he interacted with merchants all the time on very, very good terms.
Well, we all do, right? We all buy, sell. Well, in a sense, everybody is there, but it's just, yeah, whether you do it professionally in different society, are you, yeah, I mean, like you're saying, merchant and scholar. I mean, it's most like a lot of Asian countries, scholars are highly regarded, but not merchants. But you're saying actually, they are the same, almost like you're saying they are almost the same people in Muslim countries. Is that right? Or
They were the same people, but they were compatible.
okay, yeah.
Whereas in China, the Confucian scholars tended to look down their noses at
I know that's true. Yes,
you know
I'm not saying it's right, but
very interesting. Any more questions?
are you
Yes, actually. Dr. Dunn, could you expand a little bit more about the particular schools of law that were present?
yeah there are four major schools of law that interpret the Quran and the Hadith in slightly different ways, and bodies of law that have developed since then. There are four major schools of Islamic law. The one that was practiced in North Africa was the Maliki school of law, and so Ibn Battuta was educated in that. The differences uh, between the four schools, I'm not a legal scholar, so I can't go into detail about this, but the four schools, they're they're different in rather minute points of law, not the overall approach to the Sharia, the Islamic law, including how you perform the prayer, slight differences in physical gestures in performing the prayer, things like that, and much more. The Maliki school was regarded as quite a conservative school. Ibn Battuta, when he went to Mali, he was really incensed that women were going bare-breasted in the Mali Empire in the court, even though the Sultan of Mali, the Emperor Mali, was a Muslim, and many members of the royal court, most of them were Muslims, and you know, he found that to be egregiously uncalled for the women to be going bare-breasted, and so he had a really conservative view of most things. When he went to when he went to India was, you know, he became a judge in India and served the Sultan in that respect. But the Maliki school was not practiced in India. It was the Hanafi school of law. And, you know, the differences are not extraordinary, but they are there. And so Ibn Battuta admits that he had what he called this, substitutes. That is, people who worked for him who were schooled in the Hanafi law, and he would, we presume, consult with them about making decisions in adjudicating cases insofar as he did that, because he didn't know the Hanafi school of law. He only knew the Maliki school. But he went to the Maldive Islands, and it turns out that in the Maldive Islands they practiced the Maliki school of law. So he was right at home there, and he took his job as a qadi or judge in the Maldive Islands very seriously. So the difference is the Shafi'i school, the Maliki school, the Hanafi school, the what's the other one? The Hanbali school. They differ in points of detail. And
Thank you.
Fundamentally, they're not incompatible with each other. Does that?
And then, yeah, that was great. Thank you. And then just one final question from me, anyway. Did Battuta ever really come forward and say that he was, you know, practicing Sufism? Or, I mean, I got the sense that he was rather hesitant in the beginning to kind of throw his weight behind them. Is that something that changed later in his life? Do you know?
I don't know where you. I'd be interested to know where you picked that up. He was clearly given a Sufi. There was a Sufi dimension to his education, because by the 14th century it was very popular in Morocco, and Sufi orders, Sufi fraternities were being established, and so when he went on his travels, he was repeatedly visiting Sufi zawiyas, they call them in Morocco, or lodges, Sufi centers, where the Sufi people would join together to dance and sing and chant and chant the Quran, read the Quran, and so on. So pretty much everywhere he went, he associated with them. And in some places, he says that the Sufi master, the head of the lodge, gave him a patched robe. Sufi, the word Sufi comes from the Arabic suf, referring to wool, and more broadly, it refers to the woolen garments, patched woolen garments that Sufis wore. And the patching of the garments meant that you was a kind of a recognition of poverty. You know, that Sufis are dedicated to God. They're not dedicated to having lots of new clothes. So the patched robe was a symbolic element of the Sufi way of life. And he was being given these robes, these patched robes, as gifts by the master. And he reports that in his book, and says, "Wow, you know, this was very important to me." At one point, he said, I was in this Sufi lodge, and I really thought I'm just going to stay here for the rest of my life and devote myself to prayer, and I'm not going to go anywhere. But in a matter of days, he was up and out of there and off on the road again. He couldn't help himself.
That's fair. I guess that was more of what I was getting at is like, yeah, he sought them out, but he never really fully committed to just sitting down and I mean, he could have very easily learned under one and become one, and
Oh, absolutely.
he just didn't.
Yeah, you're right. He certainly could have. And I wish we knew something about his life after he got back to Morocco, because he lived until 1368. So he was back for 10 or 15 years. And my guess is that he affiliated with the Sufi order. Sufi fraternities were spreading very rapidly across the whole uh, Islamic world in his time and thereafter.
Very nice.
Yeah.
I was reading with interest the travels in the Arabian Sea and how the monsoons really dictated the direction of travel because of the predictability of the trade winds. And I was fascinated by the description you gave of some of the seagoing vessels and things like that. And it almost sounded as if it would have been nice if Ibn Battuta had been more interested in the types of vessels. So I was wondering if you were to talk to Ibn Battuta and ask him to recall, what would you have liked to have heard him say about the seagoing vessels that he didn't say?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because there were many types of these vessels. Um, he traveled by sea in the Mediterranean, and he doesn't give a clue. He actually traveled on a Genoese vessel, which so he hung out with Christians occasionally. Um, and he doesn't say anything about what sort of vessel it was. In the Indian Ocean, I mean, we just know because all of them were fore and aft sail vessels, lateen uh, sails that were in this, triangular shaped sails that were very, very good for sailing against the wind, when you had to. And but there's actually been quite a controversy recently about that in some of the literature, because there's um, a painting from the 11th, 12th century of people on a ship, and it looks like the sail is a square rigged sail, like it's a straight mast up and down, which would have a square sail on it. And the author's arguing that we've got the sail construction all wrong. They may have had lateen sails, but they also had square sails, and others said they didn't have any square sails. Uh, this is the sort of arguments that take up the time of academic people like me. But Ibn Battuta, it's disconcerting because he refuses to describe these ships, except the Chinese vessel that he saw and was going to travel on when he left India and they had that disaster. And he does describe the Chinese vessels, and uh, they were impressive. And I think he was so impressed he felt he had to describe their size and the fact that you had private quarters for you and your concubines, and they grew food on the vessel and so on. So he's better, a little bit better with the Chinese ships, but he doesn't say in his Mediterranean and Indian Ocean travels. I would like to know a lot more about the sail design, how big they were, and so on.
Are you a sailor yourself?
No,
Oh, okay.
that's a categorical. I've been I've been on sailboats. I
Mhm.
sailed on the Nile in a little lateen rigged vessel, but I don't have much experience with them. You'd think that would not be the case because I live about a 15-minute walk from the Los Angeles Marina.
Oh,
Well, the sailboats in America, it's like for fun, it's sports, but in China, it was transportation. So I grew up by the Yangtze River, and there's a sailboats all the time shipping for shipment. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Interesting.
I went to China in 2011, but unfortunately I didn't get to Guangzhou and other cities that Ibn Battuta uh, says he visited, although he never gives much description of them. He didn't like China very much because they ate pig.
That's
It was a terrible thing.
Just a little side note: the famous Chinese emissary with these giant ships around the same time was Zhang He. I don't know if that name, Ross, is part of your uh, uh, ideas around this, but he had this amazing fleet that were these ships that we're talking about. These were huge Chinese vessels
Yeah.
that were unheard of in terms of their architecture and size, with huge crews, and they traveled the world selling Chinese goods.
Yeah, the voyages of Cheng He were, they were diplomatic missions primarily to establish relations between the Sultan not the Sultan, the Emperor, uh, and other peoples. But yeah, there was a lot of, I'm sure, trading that went on in the process. It's pretty extraordinary. But they were building. We know from Ibn Battuta and others that they were building ships like that, long before Cheng He.
I have a question. Would you, I mean, after the research that you've done, what were the population displacement of travelers along the African continent and Asia continent? Was there a lot of people moving and settling and then back again, moving and settling, or was it only merchant roads, not people picking up and moving?
Oh boy. Oh yeah, that's a lot of people were traveling.
Yeah.
I mean, scholars just looking for books to buy would travel hundreds of miles. Scholarly travel was very, very common. We talked about Sufis who would travel who really acted as missionaries, traveling long distances. There were migrations of people. I'm trying to think. Well, I have a slide about it, and I've written an article about it. That Ibn Battuta's time, he we know him because he wrote a book, and there were thousands of scholars like him who were out there traveling who never got to write a book about it.
Yeah.
Uh, he was he was he was typical of scholars who were traveling, and this was a period, the 14th century, when Islam was spreading widely into Africa, into Southeast Asia, into Central Asia, and everywhere that rulers accepted Islam, they wanted to surround themselves with highly educated Muslims to serve them. And it was a matter of prestige
Mhm.
for like a Turkic Muslim ruler whose grandfathers were, you know, were horse herders.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
they've now become conquerors and rulers, and they're setting up a royal court and surrounding themselves with Muslim, not just scholars, but artists and calligraphers and entertainers and so on. It was a highly prestigious thing to do. So there were thousands of Muslims that were on the road, you know, all the time during this period. It sort of changes later on in the 16th century with the rise of very large Muslim empires. The rulers transformed the ulama class, the learned class, more into employees of the state. They're not so cosmopolitan anymore from the 16th century as they were. But you know, they were still traveling.
So just so in other words, it was open to Muslims when they entered those, kingdoms or those geographic areas. But how about other faiths? Were they like always traveling all over, or was it because they were Muslims, they were accepted in, China, India, all those places?
Yeah, well, of course, Muslims initially went to China as merchants.
Yeah.
And they stayed. And then once you establish a community, you've got to have all sorts of other kinds of people there. You've got to have scholars because scholars are the ones who establish the religion.
Yes.
And supervise the mosques and the Sufi lodges and the law courts and so on. And so these Muslim communities were established all the way from southern China to Morocco. One of the questions that comes up is why didn't Ibn Battuta travel in Europe? I mean, it was right next door. He did visit Sardinia on his way home, very, very briefly. And he visited Constantinople when it was under Christian rule. So it wasn't that he would refuse to go to a Christian ruled area. But for him to travel in, up in Spain or France or England or Germany, there weren't Muslims there. And it wasn't because he'd be killed and hated as much as it just wasn't the infrastructure for a Muslim to travel. Where do you get a meal? There's no mosque, right? So it was not a place that he really thought of going, and I understand that. It's interesting that there is very little, really no sectarian hatred expressed by Ibn Battuta toward Christians or toward Jews. You just don't see that at all. He makes one comment about the fact that a Jew in a princely court, there was a Jew there, a Jewish scholar probably, and Ibn Battuta complains in his book that he was seated in the wrong place. He was seated too far down front. The Jewish scholar should have been up in the back. And I think he wrote things like that in his book for the consumption of the fellow scholars in Morocco, who would have said, "Oh yes, you can't let the Jewish scholars sit in the front row," that sort of thing. But other than that, the only people he really didn't like were Shiites, because he saw them as, they call them Rafidi, turncoats, that they betrayed the Sunni mainstream version of Islam. So he talks about going around certain villages because they were Shia villages, because he didn't want to associate with those people. But there was no bloodshed involved.
Thank you.
Could I ask about when the Muslim travelers and merchants went to set up colonies, did they send back for their wives to come and join them, or how did the families? No, they. They found new wives where they settled.
They probably divorced them before they left.
Oh.
If they knew they weren't coming back for a while. Divorce was not a difficult thing to do. I just talked to a friend in England this morning whose son is having a terrible row over a divorce and costing thousands of dollars. In the Islamic tradition, it was rather easier, at least back then, to divorce. And Ibn Battuta was married and divorced, as you see in the book, several times, and he never traveled. He traveled with slave girls for his pleasure, but he never traveled with his wives, and that was the standard in the Islamic tradition of them that you either divorced the wife or you left her behind if you were going on a mercantile trip or scholarly trip or whatever. So no, they didn't. He had 4 wives simultaneously in the Maldive Islands, the legal limit, as you know. And he divorced all of them.
So, besides Ibn Battuta, the merchants that he encountered along the way, well, maybe he didn't encounter a lot of them because he mainly stayed and met the more of the elite. But in general, there were a number of Islamic colonies that were set up by the traders and merchants, and some who lived in these places permanently. So they found wives where they settled.
Yeah.
Okay. They didn't. So
that would be standard procedure.
So how did they pass? So the only reason that the religion would be brought down from one generation to another was through the local clerics and the qadis and the Sufis, or the various holy people and religious people then.
Well, whoever lived there, Muslim merchants, artisans, whoever was in the community, males would marry local women.
Okay.
And wives,
Okay.
wives seldom traveled long distances with husbands.
Okay. Thank you.
It was a lot of trouble to keep them sheltered and keep them at home because there wasn't any home.
So throughout the ages, then, as the Islamic traders settled down and married local women, was the religion not diluted in any way because of the presence of the clerics and the qadis and the various other people who kept the Islamic culture pretty true or pretty much alive?
Yeah, I think we'd have to look at the particular locale where this was happening. There clearly was syncretism going on, right? The blending of the different traditions. So when Ibn Battuta was in Mali, for example, the ruling class were Muslims. The emperor was a Muslim. There were all sorts of ulama, scholars around. But if they were local, there were elements to their practice of Islam that he didn't like. He talks about going to visit a local Muslim scholar, an African Muslim scholar, and he had this woman in the room with him. And Ibn Battuta says, "Well, who's she?" And he said, "This is my companion." What are you doing in your official residence here with this companion? And he said, to them it was just perfectly natural, but I can't accept such a thing as that. So, and there were various rituals in the Mali court that if you came before the presence of the emperor, you had to prostrate yourself full out on the ground and throw dust over your head. And And he found all that sort of thing rubbish in his.
Very interesting.
So, so he encountered, that in Islamic practice here and there, but he, I should say that, he was all that time in India, and the majority population in India was Hindu. And he says almost nothing about the Hindu tradition or the possible blending of Hindu and Islamic beliefs, even though that we know the Sufis did bring that sort of thing to India, where they were Muslims, but they made compromises with Hindu ideas and so on. But he doesn't talk about that. And you think in Ibn Battutta's book that there were no Hindus in India at all, except the odd places where he mentions them. But that wasn't the purpose of his book. His book was not to be a universal ethnography. It was to be a book about Muslim communities and his experience with Muslim communities wherever he went. So he says very little about Hindu women. There are some exceptions. One of them is that he remarks about that Hindu women, man, do they know a lot of different positions.
Well, that's great. Any more questions before we wrap up? It's 8 o'clock, so that's our time to wrap up. And I want to thank Professor Dunn for an amazing, explanation and PowerPoint for this book. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Ross, thank you very much. It's been great to meet you, and Jemima, thank you for keeping this thing rolling. So somehow our paths will all cross again, I'm sure. So
Yes. Well, as it shows in the book, we're all a juxtaposition of many cultures, right?
right.
That
David,
we're learning from.
if anybody has more questions about the book or
Yes.
something like that, I'd be happy to answer.
I can tell you this, you can call Ross and he'll answer the phone.
Yeah. I've recorded this session, Professor Ross, and I will send it to our membership if you don't mind.
Sorry, send what?
I have recorded the session on Zoom, and I'm going to send it through to the membership if you don't mind.
Yeah, you promised not to publish it on YouTube.
No, we will not publish it on YouTube.
Ross, I'm going to, as I said, ring you offline. So I want to talk to you some more.
And we hope to see you in Michigan, for sure.
Well, we've got, my wife has her sister there, and our nephew teaches sociology at Henry Ford College.
Okay,
Oh,
wonderful.
Right.
Okay,
I'm going to sign off. Good night, everybody. Thank
Good
you
night.
all.
thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ross.
Thank you.
Jemima, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mana. That was fabulous.
Great. Thank you very much for joining.